Charting a new normal amid COVID-19 includes the adoption of innovative working arrangements to allow for greater level of productivity and a stronger sense of reward. So what are the options out there? To answer this question, I have Professor Yang Hee-dong from Ewha Women's University. Welcome back, Professor Yang.
Thank you for inviting me.
Right, and joining this session virtually is Professor Marlon Twyman at the University of Southern California. It's a pleasure to have you with us, Professor Twyman.
Yeah, thank you, Sunny. Happy to be here.
Right. Professor Yang, we'll start here in the studio then. Let's begin with efforts by companies here and elsewhere to adapt their working environment to COVID-19 strategies, exit strategies, that is.
Yeah, I mean, there are many interesting instances in the cases about the telecommuting. The working from home, whether, wherever you stay, is called as telecommuting. And here's a very interesting announcement by World Economic Forum recently. And they had a survey about the preference of telecommuting for the laborers. And they found that more than 60% of laborers prefer the telecommuting. The majority of people, they, instead of working in the traditional offline office, they prefer to work at home. And examples include most of big IT companies such as Amazon, Apple, Microsoft, all those IT firms, do care about the productivity rather than the ways how their employees and laborers, come to work in the office. And the most interesting example is PwC, the global consulting firm. And they announced, actually they instructed to the employees that they can work anywhere in the world. And they can come to office at maximum 3 times a month. But this condition will be applied only to the back office administrators. In other words, if you have to face with the customers, you are, accepted from this instruction. Of course, there are the antagonists about this idea. For example, Netflix, Reed Hastings, one of very respected CEO, he doesn't like the idea of telecommuting. So I know that there are some pros and cons of these issues and advocates or the antagonists of the telecommuting, but I should say that the majority of the companies, prefer this idea. And let me add one more survey, presented by Morgan Stanley, and they found that more than 69% of American firms prefer telecommuting.
Right. Right then, Professor Twyman, as Professor Yang has mentioned, pundits do agree that the pandemic has dramatically transformed global working patterns, including corporate culture. Would you like to elaborate on that first?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And just to piggyback on some of the ideas that have been brought up so far, I think one of the main cultural shifts we're starting to see is really this notion of flexibility on behalf of the employer and giving the employees or the laborers a lot more agency and autonomy in how they choose to get their work done. So, for example, this looks like not only just the telecommuting aspect, but also how they'll be working, whether that's asynchronously or by themselves, mostly through emails when they do need to communicate, or whether or not they'll have a lot more rhythmic communication that happens throughout the day. And from what I've seen, just based on my research and in the United States, it appears that there's a lot of momentum actually to supporting workers who choose to adopt this lifestyle moving forward as we continue to live with the pandemic.
Professor Twyman, what has been the general response to remote working among members of the public in the US?
In general, I would say the response has been mixed, and that basically seems to be coming from the type of industry that the worker themselves are a part of. So, for example, for those IT workers, a lot of them have relocated, moved out of urban environments to a lot more spacious or rural areas to enjoy more lifestyle changes, rather. However, there are other industries where employees are actually looking forward to being in more dialogue, constant communication, have a higher range of interactivity in their work with their colleagues as seen through the common office interactions. So there's actually a great deal of variability there. And there are a lot of big organizations that are trying to effectively decide what works best for their business models.
Right. Meanwhile, Professor Yang, back here in Korea, according to the Bank of Korea, hybrid working arrangements will be the new normal on the local front as we move beyond this pandemic. Do you share this outlook?
Yes, I do agree. Well, before we talk about the hybrid mode of working, we need to understand the flexible, the working programming. Flexible work programming means you can choose your working hours anytime, according to your contract. So you can start to work like at 10 a.m., 11 a.m., it's up to you. And out of this, the flexible time workers, about 68% of people prefer to work for the telecommuting. That's the case in the U.S. But in Korea, this preference stays quite lower, such as 5% about 2 years ago. But now this ratio has increased to 17.4% last year. That means more than 5 times has been increased for the Korean workers who prefer to work, through the telecommuting with the flexible, working hours. And the BBC also announced a very recent survey that more than 72% of the British workers prefer in hybrid mode. I mean, this number is quite surprising because only 12% of British people prefer to work in the traditional way, working in the offline places. So, but the major issue with this, trend towards hybrid mode of working, it depends on the culture and the philosophy of the CEOs. Because in Korea, we will get back to this later on, but it's quite tough in terms of the culture. I mean, even though you may have a solid reason and regulations or policy within your organization, you have to take a look at it, consider others, the impression about your attitudes of working. So, I mean, you can control over this culture by any instructions or policy or whatever. But still remains as very, very critical factor to promote the telecommuting with the flexible working hours. But that is a very, very general trend in Korea. You can ignore it.
Right. So widespread application or adoption of the hybrid working arrangement, online and offline mixed together, is not likely in the country then in the near future.
Well, it may take time again because this is a matter of culture. It's not just to snap your fingers and you just start to work the flexible hours and stay at home and talking to your boss through internet or whatever. It just takes time.
Right. Now, for the sake of a comparison then, Professor Twyman, what can you tell us about the long-term prospects of working patterns in the US as the US learns to live with COVID-19?
Yeah, so I'm loving this conversation because what we're seeing in the United States is there's a lot more just positive reception on behalf of the actual employees at imagining what their lives could look like outside of that office on a typical 5-day work week. So we are seeing more companies adopt the hybrid strategy formally, sometimes on the order of, say, 3 times a week in person, others moving towards just once a month, whereas even some government agencies for the first time ever actually moving toward a fully remote model, which they have rejected for a long time. And I think what's really interesting here in the United States is that our technological advancements with respect to workplace monitoring and task management, as well as just simple awareness or surveillance of the employee productivity, has helped move along a lot of these more positive receptions where workers are now feeling as though, hey, when I'm logged in, when I'm working, I've made my availability transparent to you, the employer, I'm getting my work done. Let's continue to move forward in a productive manner and just really save time and energy from the commute and put that into my labor for the company. And then in the long term, I do agree also that it is culturally, not every organization will choose to adopt a fully remote or even a hybrid strategy for their employees' work, but that's really going to be an idiosyncratic choice, mostly driven by the competitive landscape in a given industry.
Right, of course. Professor Yang, there are no doubt trade-offs for companies that choose to maintain remote working. For example, potential exposure to cybercrimes or perhaps a creativity crisis, if I may, owing to reduced interpersonal collaboration between among workers, that is. And yet some employers are considering this option of remote working. Why do you suppose this is the case?
Well, there are many reasons, depending on or impact on the effectiveness of this remote working or telecommuting. The first one is it's really up to the characteristics of the work. As already mentioned, the IT, is a very representative example where, remote working or telecommuting can work very well because most of the programs are, operating in modules. So once you take care of your own modules, all these individual modules will work and supposed to collaborate through the outputs out of this module. You don't care about the inside of the other modules. And this software, characteristic impact on the way they do, they count on their work because, each other's, you don't care about each other's, the work process or work attitude. But I think I need to cite the research by Nicholas Bloom of Stanford University about the advantages or disadvantages of remote work. Well, the positive aspects include on the reduction of the costs from the perspective of the enterprises. So, for example, we can reduce about 20 or 30% of your working offices. And also, the employees can enhance their productivity because you can enjoy your own free time, you can control over your working pace, and you can enhance your concentration, right? And also, the Nicholas mentioned that this increase in personal productivity will up to 20 or 30%. But negative aspects are also very numerous. For example, you can lose the focus on your work because you have so many distractions in your home. Particularly if you're mothers of two very pranky, twins or kids, you'll be in big trouble. And also, it'd be very, very tough to coordinate the collaborations or communications, particularly through, your bosses or whatever, because your boss is all the time very, very busy. So, of course, there are many pros and cons over this, the remote work, but we can ignore, again, the general trend towards in hybrid. So we need to figure out how we can increase the positive aspect, how we can reduce or eliminate the negative aspect of this, this issue.
Right, there are many tasks to be tackled then.
Right.
Professor Twyman, I think you mentioned this a while back, but how do you respond to concerns that remote working hamstrings productive communication?
Great question. I would say that it doesn't necessarily limit or constrain communication so much as it forces us to be a little more intentional in our communication. So a long line of historical research on computer-mediated communication has pointed out how the relative lack of richness of digital communication really puts one at an information disadvantage compared to face-to-face, really just more in-person conversations. However, what we're seeing through the just plethora of now available technologies between social media, instant messaging apps, how much interactivity is available through video conferencing or video call software, we're seeing a lot of that richness being restored to digital communication. And what this means is now the employees or the workers, while they might lose the spontaneity or just the random kind of dialogues that could happen from disruptive or interruptions to their work, they have more control over when they engage. And in a lot of cases, they're not necessarily missing out on that same level of richness that we can find in more in-person, in-office settings.
Right. Professor Young, Professor Twyman mentioned this, but given the relative flexibility offered by remote working, do you suppose this reality may perhaps offer women greater working opportunities?
Well, I should be more careful in making any conclusions because there's a very interesting report that over 1/3 of the remote workers are burnt out. That means there should be some stress from the inside of the home, right? They may deteriorate the work productivity, for the remote workers. For example, over the 80% of the women feel more precious about their home affairs if they work in remote, they work in their home. And so I think there are two major pressures for this burnout and the more, pressures for the female workers, for the remote workers. The first one is this pressure comes from the employers of the company. So the more kids these women have, and the smaller these kids are, the more likely they will receive any, the pressures from the top, such as leave of absence or even the layoff, whatever. So they are exposed to restructuring under the execution of, improving the productivity or the reducing, costs or whatever. And the second pressure for the female remote workers comes from inside the family, because in Korean culture, home affairs are the realm for the females rather than for the males. So unless these female remote workers earn great support or cooperation or collaboration from their spouses, and they will be really stressed out, even more from this remote working. So we need the solutions. We need to figure out both of outside and inside the pressures that may deteriorate the quality and productivity of the female remote workers.
Right, and staying with that, Professor Twyman, a clear downside, of course, of working at home, as mentioned by Professor Young, is the blurry boundary between one's personal and professional lives. In fact, a greater number of people, as Professor Young has clearly said, reported that they experienced, that is, burnouts amid the pandemic more than pre-pandemic times. What do you propose then to address this unfortunate repercussion of remote working?
So I think one of the biggest consequences of what we've learned as a global society is that no one really has a good idea of whose responsibility it is to ensure work-life balance and really maintaining the health of the worker. But this is a great time to have the conversation. Overall, I would say we're now entering into an era where a lot of people have had to reconfigure their living spaces to accommodate their work, right? They've maybe had to convert a bedroom or reorient their primary living room in a way that they did not anticipate and in a way that they did not want. And where this becomes an issue is that there have been many working adults in the white collar professions who have chosen to adopt a work from home lifestyle and have done that for years, even without the need caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. But those are people who opted into or wanted that way of living. It wasn't forced upon them like we've seen for a vast majority of work from home workers since the pandemic started. And so these are people who have had to make very real adjustments. As my colleague here has said on the broadcast, we also have people who have had to manage or balance childcare while simultaneously working due to restrictions or mandates with respect to the availability of child and family care. And so what we're seeing with respect to burnout is simply the result of a way of working in largely an emergency situation being forced upon a large group of people who have had limited access to support. And we need to be having this conversation around who's responsible for providing such support and when is this going to happen.
Right. And moving slightly beyond offline and online working, Professor Young, what are your thoughts then on the adoption of 4 working days as opposed to 5, perhaps as a possible solution to remedy the burnout experienced by some of the workers?
Yeah, I mean, there are already many countries that apply 4-day work per week, such as Iceland and Finland and New Zealand and Scotland. Even the Scotland government has prepared about $60 million to support the companies if they apply for their work, the schedule for the employees. But I need to make a couple of comments on this issue. The first one is, we already talked about the work-life balance, particularly for the female, the remote workers. And here's a very interesting research, published by the Claudia Goldin of Harvard University. And she mentioned that the greedy work is a major reason for the gap pay, gender pay gap. In other words, greedy work means like you overwork or working the weekends. They used to be dominated by the males because, again, home affairs, particularly in the nighttime or weekends, are the jobs of the females. So, and then she, insisted that this greedy work should be shared between different genders or different people. A good example is the pharmacist. So they equally share this kind of greedy work, overwork with all the employees. The pay rate is pretty similar. So that could be one of the way to apply or implement the 4-day work program. In other words, if we share extra work or particularly during the busy season, we can apply for the work schedules. And another one is this is from even the government perspective. This is a very effective way to decrease your unemployment rate. I mean, this month and last month our unemployment rate went down to 2 points, where we used to have over the 5% in this January. What is the trick to reduce the unemployment rate? This kind of mode, there is employing more people to share gritty work and hard work. That could be the best way, not just to implement 4-day working period in the program, but also to reduce our unemployment rate.
Right, reduce working hours and reducing our workload then.
Right, I'm absolutely in favor of that,
Right.
the program, that vision.
Professor Twyman, let's end with a few words from you for employers and employees in general as we shift to diverse working arrangements amid our efforts to coexist with COVID-19.
Yeah, thank you. Compassion is key, people. This is something that we're all learning to navigate a largely uncertain climate with respect to public health, what it means for the economy writ large, and both employees and employers. I think compassion will go a long way. Checking in with colleagues, whether or not they're supervisors or subordinates, just being willing to tolerate, say, a late deliverable that may not necessarily be mission critical, and just offering support for people, because you never know who's been directly affected by some of these very major issues that a vast majority of us are navigating. And so that's what I would say: compassion for your colleagues. We spend a lot of time with each other and try to keep the positivity.
Right. I think remote working makes some people realize that they do miss working with their colleagues inside the office as well. All right, Professor Twyman, thank you very much for your kind words. And Professor Young here in the studio, thank you for your time today.
Thank you.